we begin this hour with the stated mission of the Department of Justice. Post is on its website. That mission is listed as to uphold the rule of law, to keep our country safe, and to protect civil rights. Simple but complex mission. And yet, under this administration, we've seen that mission change, at least among the DOJ's leadership, to focus on upholding the whims and vendettas of the man who falsely claims to be the country's chief law enforcement officer. But for the rank and file at the DOJ, the career prosecutors, the people who actually do the work, we've seen an adherence to the real mission and a willingness to push back against this administration, even at the risk of losing their jobs. Let's look at this past weekend. In the case of the arrest of independent journalist Don Lemon for covering an anti-ICE protest during a Minnesota church service, MS Now has learned that many career prosecutors in both Minnesota and Los Angeles refused to be involved in this case, claiming the evidence did not support the charges. When the FBI raided the Fulton County election office in Georgia and seized the ballots from the 2020 election, it was done without the special agent in charge of the FBI's Atlanta field office. He was forced out for questioning the renewed push into Trump's unsubstantiated allegations and lies about voter fraud, and refusing to carry out the very search and seizure we saw play out. And the acting chief of the FBI field office in Minnesota was also removed by FBI headquarters, two sources tell MS Now. It came amid several FBI agents there having disputes with FBI superiors and Justice Department political leadership over their push to arrest people protesting immigration raids, as well as the department's decision not to pursue a civil rights investigation into the fatal shooting of Renee Good. Joining us now to get into all of that and more, Norm Eisen, founder and executive chair of the Democracy Defenders Fund and former special counsel and special assistant to President Obama. And Joyce Vance, MS Now legal analyst and former U.S. attorney. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning. I want to head to, unfortunately, a social media post first. Chad Mizell, he is the acting general counsel for DHS. And we saw this last night. Quote, if you are a lawyer, are interested in being an AUSA, and support President Trump and anti-crime agenda, DM me. We need good prosecutors, and DOJ is hiring across the country. Now is your chance to join the mission and do good for your country. Joyce, when you look at that, see that, hear that, one, what does it tell you about the kinds of people who have left, the amount of people who have left? And two, what does it tell you about the kinds of people that the DOJ wants in their ranks now?
Right. So it's clear that what's happening is the politicization of DOJ. You know, this is no longer the Justice Department that I worked at or the Justice Department that Norm interacted with. This is a Justice Department that's clearly the president's personal law firm, at least at the top. And I think that that distinction is important. You talked about the career prosecutors at DOJ. Across the country, they're just trying to do their jobs and hold on. They are not political people. I was one of them for many, many years. What Mizell is saying, and it's worth pointing out, by the way, that he's not a DOJ employee. He has nothing to do with hiring federal prosecutors. And so the notion that he would have the audacity to ignore rules and regulations that govern federal hiring and just say, hey, DM me if you're aligned with the president's political agenda. It's unbelievably disheartening to prosecutors across the country trying to do their jobs with integrity. It is a warning sign that we should all heed. We cannot afford to let the power of prosecution become purely political, and it's time for Congress to get engaged and act.
Norm, you were in Minneapolis this week. We know that you have your hands in a million different cases with various different clients. Can you talk about any of the conversations you were having on the ground with state and local officials, and also your reaction to U.S. District Court Judge Kate Menendez rejecting the motion to try to get ICE out of the state?
Jackie, the conversations in Minneapolis and in Minnesota were absolutely extraordinary, meeting with both political leaders but also civil rights ones in the state and from around the country. I actually spent part of my time with the head of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, the head of LULAC, our nation's most prominent Latino, oldest and largest Latino civil rights organization. I've litigated with both of them and together with local civil rights leaders. And what we saw in Minneapolis, I very seldom quote Steve Bannon, but Bannon said Trump didn't just crash, he cratered. And what we saw in Minneapolis is something that the four of us have talked about all year. Every dimension of the pro-democracy, pro-constitution coalition coming together. It wasn't just political leadership. It wasn't just public protesters, and I talked to a lot of them. It's court proceedings, where among the successful proceedings there, the evidence is being preserved for possible future criminal prosecution, and massive public protest that even reverberated in Washington with the DHS funding bill. So Minneapolis is ground zero, as Birmingham was in 1963 or Selma was in 1965. Minneapolis is the center of the opposition to Trump, and every dimension of that opposition pushed him back this week. Big win for democracy at a terrible cost.
Joyce, I was going to ask you something else, but Norm bringing up Birmingham, you are in Montgomery or Birmingham right now?
Birmingham.
You're
Birmingham
in
today.
Birmingham. There's been a lot of parallels. Norm just made a parallel. I'm a student of civil rights history, small s student of civil rights history. You being in Alabama, do you see or even feel those parallels between what happened in your state 60 years ago and what's happening in a state, the opposite end of the country, thousands of miles north in Minnesota?
They're impossible to avoid at this point, Jonathan. And something I had the opportunity to do as the U.S. attorney in my city, and a lot of this was based on my father-in-law's work integrating the Democratic Party following the era of George Wallace. But I had the opportunity really to learn from civil rights leaders and equally as importantly from the foot soldiers, the people who crossed the bridge in Selma, some of the children who marched in Birmingham and then grew up to become civil rights advocates. And the lessons that we learned in Birmingham are now being executed in Minneapolis. The lesson is to always work on an issue like this in community, to build a diverse group of people committed to doing the right thing and continuing to put one foot in front of the other and march. And you know, something that Ann Applebaum was talking about with y'all earlier is the importance of not giving up and of understanding that what we do today can make a difference. That was the lesson of Birmingham. What was impossible, integrating the city, bringing about equality for black citizens, work towards that was completed because folks refused to give up. Now it's Minneapolis's turn and all of our turn to support them to try to put an end to this unconstitutional policing, this abuse of the system that the administration is perpetrating in Minnesota.
Norm, one of the things we also saw this week is, you know, the Trump administration, the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, on the ground in Fulton County, Georgia, executing an FBI search warrant, one that was allowed by a judge, taking ballots from 2020 that were on pallets that were supposed to be archived. I'm going to read something from the New York Times that was written on Wednesday. In an unusual twist, the prosecutor listed on the warrant is not from Georgia, but the interim U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Missouri, Thomas Albus. It is unclear what would connect prosecutors in Missouri to Mr. Trump's longstanding complaints about how the 2020 election in Georgia was conducted. At this point, we have not seen any evidence of what Donald Trump is talking about in Georgia. The only evidence we've seen and heard is him telling the Secretary of State to find him 11,000 votes. But I digress. When you hear these kinds of stories, when you see what the administration is doing and thinking about doing when it comes to 2026 and 2028, what are you and all the legal eagles who you talk about when you come on our show doing on the offensive side to make sure that this president, this administration, cannot stop people from voting and cannot meddle in states' ability to conduct elections?
First of all, the undisputed record is in court after court and tribunal after tribunal that nothing untoward happened in Fulton County. So that's been established again and again, litigated
by the Trump
extensively
administration in 2020.
and definitively established. And then in terms of protecting the election, since the beginning of Donald Trump's pivot to full-on authoritarianism, which came after he lost the 2020 election and then challenged those results, not just in Georgia, but all over the country, in 6 states all over the country. The democracy movement and the civil rights movement has been fully deployed and has been successful in court, stopping efforts to delegitimize election outcomes. I was a part representing states pro bono of many of those 63 cases that Donald Trump lost in the aftermath of the 2020 election. My organizations, Democracy Defenders Fund and Democracy Defenders Action, were in every place where there was an election in 2025, Eugene, and in none of those, we had DOJ observers and others. In none of those places, there was little blip in New Jersey. We went to court. We got an order election day stopping an effort to mess with the polls there. So it's been unsuccessful. And there are literally hundreds of groups around the country that are ready to protect the election in 26.
Norm Eisen and Joyce Vance, thank you both very much for coming back to the weekend.